How's it going, everybody? This is the Nitty Gritty. My name is Chad. With me, as always, is Leonard. How you doing today, Leonard?
I'm doing fine. How about yourself?
I'm good. And this is episode 4 of our show, and we are going to do another round in our Spotlight series. That's what we're calling it this week, anyway.
Okay, we'll call something else next time. But
yeah, so you guys got to keep track.
Mhm.
So yes, we are going to be covering Ranger Ross this week. And he is a real-life ranger. He was a real-life bank robber. And it sounds like he could be a character in The Expendables, Leonard. What do you think?
Oh, definitely so. If they would bring that back, he also, if they do another live-action GI Joe, he could hook up with the Rock for that.
I'd rather him in The Expendables than him in the GI Joe live-action movies, which I didn't like. But this is a movie show, so
That's for another show, another time, another video.
right. All right. So we are going to start off by talking about his early years. So he was born Robert Lee Ross, July 15th, 1959. He is from Ackworth, Georgia. He wrestled, he played basketball, he played football while he was in high school, and after graduating high school, he enlisted in the United States Army, where he trained as a paratrooper, and he graduated Ranger School and eventually became a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment. So his military career is absolutely legit. During his 8-year military career, he participated in many combat missions, one of which is still classified, the Iran-Contra affair. Apparently he was in that.
Yeah, and he was part of the invasion of Grenada as well, which
right.
I found out. And my uncle was in the Marine Corps at the same time, so he was there too.
Right, absolutely. And so he got into the wrestling business. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead there a little bit. But, yes, he grew up loving wrestling. He grew up with Les Thornton, Man of a Thousand Holds, as one of his idols, as well as Dick Slater. He got into the business through Pez Whatley and was eventually trained by Thunderbolt Patterson and Ted Allen. He owes a lot to Jody Hamilton as well, and Mr. Wrestling 2 in his early years. He made his professional wrestling debut on August 10th, 1986. And he did, recall that exact date of his wrestling match. He was wrestling for Jody Hamilton's promotion in Georgia. And Jody, he was facing Ted Allen. The Nightmare was his nickname. And fun fact, Ted Allen was his first match and also in his last match. So, yes, he said that the main event that night was Ken Timms versus Mr. Wrestling 2 in a lumberjack match, but that Ranger Ross faced the Nightmare. And he thanked both of them for helping him out. And he would wrestle for Knoxville, Tennessee-based promotion Continental Championship Wrestling. He briefly held the NWA Alabama Heavyweight Championship there, defeating Moondog Spot in '88. He would lose that title to Jonathan Boyd in Birmingham, Alabama, in January of 1988. So he didn't have it for very long. But hey, it's on your resume, right?
I believe it's what we call a transitional champion.
It sounds like that, but I'm sure it was exciting. He also wrestled in Atlanta for the Georgia-based promotion Southern Championship Wrestling under Jerry Blackwell. We talked about that with Big Bully Busick. He held the SCW Tag Team Championship twice, once with Joey Maggs and once with Mr. Wrestling 2. So those are his early years. So, Leonard, how important do you think the territory system was for guys that were green, learning, and improving before making it to the big stage?
Oh, a huge amount, and I think you would get that if you listen to any of the old guys talk. In preparing for this, I listened to some shoot interviews that Ranger Ross had done. People talked to him at different shows and things, and in that he talked a lot about what you just went over and how he learned so much from guys like Jody Hamilton and Ted Allen, who had been in the business for so many years and had learned so much. And he not only had respect for those guys, but he learned a lot from them. And I think, too, if you look at just a guy like Ranger Ross, the different people he worked with, different territories he went to, that by the time he got to WCW, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, he was kind of a seasoned veteran. He wasn't, today most everyone sort of gets trained when you think of WWE, get trained in their training facilities and then kind of comes up through their system. Where with a guy like Ross, you had someone who, again, like I said, different people, different territories, learn different styles. And I think if you are familiar with his work through WCW, well, as we're going to talk about, he wasn't an Iron Man. A lot of his matches were pretty short in the 5 to 7 minute mark. He did work with a lot of different people. And I think that was, I'm sure the territory system prepared him for being able to do that, working with different people on a national stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does seem like he was able to work with a lot of different people and able to adapt to different styles. And, like you said, I'm going to echo what you said, which is, I think learning different styles in different areas and, getting educated from different people and their approaches, their psychology. I think that's important in wrestling. And, obviously when I was young and being a fan of wrestling, I didn't really care about the territory system or what it meant. Looking back on it now, looking at the classics, listening to the podcast, people talking about that way, I really do see why it was important and why it was such a good thing. Because as you said, when they learn in WWE developmental and NXT, they're kind of learning it one way.
Yeah.
And, so it's important, you always hear about guys who, when they leave WWE and go to Japan or go to Germany or go to a different promotion, they kind of really up their game and, learn a little bit more.
And often then come back to WWE and then do more than they did through their first run. You can point to several guys like that. Drew McIntyre, Muhammad Hassan, or two that come off the top of my head.
Absolutely. So let's get to his spotlight years. And that starts with Jim Crockett Promotions in 1989. And that's when he joined there. He debuted for Jim Crockett Promotions at that time, and he had a short feud with the Iron Sheik. He won a match via disqualification against the Iron Sheik at Clash of the Champions 6. And this is one of his more memorable events because of his entrance. He rappelled 300 feet from the top of the Superdome in New Orleans. And, on coming down from the ceiling before facing the Iron Sheik, Ross said that he came up with that idea himself. And in an interview with Icons of Wrestling, which was a great resource, as well as High Spots did a shoot interview with him. So you'll hear us reference those things as we go on here. But in the Icons of Wrestling interview, he talked about how he, did come up with it himself, and he got a couple Army buddies to help him. And they had to, I think, like what he says, they had to take a $1 million insurance policy out on him. But, it looked really cool, but it could have been so much better, Leonard, and I'm sure you'll agree, because he talked about in the interview how the guy running the spotlight didn't do his job. So you really didn't see it very well until he got closer to the floor. But it was still a really cool thing. And, it's obvious, even if you didn't know he came up with it, it would be obvious that he did, because as we'll talk about, WCW really didn't think much of the gimmick based on how they booked him. At least that's my opinion. But, so they set everything up for that rappelling, the day before and the day of. And, it was a really cool entrance. What did you think of it?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, a few minutes ago when I said Muhammad Hassan, I meant to say Jinder Mahal, who went away and came back. Just mixed up my names there. I don't know why. Muhammad Hassan, his ears are burning now.
I'll admit. Well, he's a teacher somewhere.
Okay, well, good for him. Anyway, yeah.
When you said that, it did occur to me, and I was like, should I say something? Maybe I shouldn't.
No,
because the Undertaker killed Muhammad Hassan.
Yes. I pulled
killed him dead.
Yes, but anyway, what I wanted to say too about Ranger Ross is when we did Big Bully Music, I said that he was a guy I kind of remember in hindsight. I saw a picture or a video and went, yeah, I remember that guy. Ranger Ross was someone, when anyone ever talks about early 90s WCW or obscure guys from WCW, Ranger Ross comes to mind for me for two reasons. One is the fact that he's like a G.I. Joe character come to life, as I mentioned the G.I. Joe movies earlier, because to me, I don't know if this was something they did on purpose. It would surprise me they didn't, but when they did the original line of the 3 3/4 inch Joes, when we were kids in the 80s, Stalker was one of the Joes, and he was a former Army Ranger. African American, mustache, about the same size and build, wore a beret. Later, Stalker figures had the black jacket that Ranger Ross would wear to the ring. So very much a Ranger Ross clone. So this was when I was 10 to 12 years old when he was wrestling on the national spotlight. That's something that stuck with me. And the second thing that I always remember about him that stuck with me is that repelling from the ceiling bit. I was a huge fan of the Clash of the Champions at the time because usually they ran those against WWE pay-per-views that I couldn't watch.
Right.
I remember that one very distinctly. And yeah, I remember it too as a kid. Like I didn't know the story. Now we know the story. But at the time I was like, oh, even as a kid, I'm like, oh, did the camera miss it? Did we come back from commercial late? Because it was like you just saw the last couple feet, it seemed, of him coming down. And it should be mentioned, this was before Shawn Michaels did the bit at WrestleMania coming down the zip line, or anybody did anything, coming down from the ceiling, at least I can think of. So, the fact that was a very unique and different entrance, again, that's something that stuck with me for years and years too. And yeah, a really cool thing. I think it could have been cooler if they, like you said, if the guy with the spotlight would have done his job. It's hard to say one little thing like that would have changed his career, but you don't know. If that's something if that becomes a thing that everyone talks about the next day, hey, did you see the guy repel from the ceiling? Right. Then that could have helped them to give him more of a push.
Well, yeah, no, and I mean, I certainly think it might have given him a little bit of a boost, if nothing else. But ultimately, WCW, and you know what, JR talked about this in an episode of Grilling JR. He said about this match, it's obvious they didn't think much of the gimmick because he had a DQ win against the Sheik in like 2 to 3 minutes. So it's obvious that they really didn't care much, and which is a shame because, as we'll talk more about, like he had an idea, he was passionate about it, and it could have been better. And on the, well, you know what, we'll talk about some of his matches with the Sheik a little bit later. But to end up in some of his spotlight years here, throughout his career, he would, with Jim Crockett Promotions, NWA or WCW, he would tag with various people: Eddie Gilbert, Tommy Rich, and Ron Simmons to a point. He also had a feud with Simmons, and he said at one point that he was, he had spoken to Dusty Rhodes, and he was going to film some vignettes where he would train Ron Simmons. And I guess that was supposed to be a bigger feud, but I guess it didn't end up happening. But he also had a feud with the Cuban Assassin, and he would tour Japan with WCW and face Abdullah the Butcher and tag with him as well. And he said he loved being in Japan, that they were much nicer, than everybody was in the States, and that, they had cars ready for them and everything. So I have to say, Leonard, when you talked to me about doing Ranger Ross, like in my head, like I remembered some military characters in WCW, but I was picturing Sergeant Craig Pittman. I don't know.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That name.
Which we should do sometime as well. But
right.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, that's not the same guy. But you know what? I would also say has a stark contrast to who we covered previously, Big Bully Busick, because this is a guy, and this is not a knock on Big Bully Busick, but I would say Ranger Ross is a guy who committed fully to his gimmick because he was his gimmick in real life.
Yeah.
But I don't think WCW invested in him. And I think that that's really clear because, as we talked about before we got on, his matches were all very short. Like even Big Bully Busick had a match or so that was like north of 10 minutes. But, you'd be hard pressed to find it. I'm sure they're out there, but like there's not many main matches that Ranger Ross had that were very long. And, it's too bad, like, because you can't find much promo work that he did, but the promo work that I saw, I think he had a lot of potential. I thought that he had a good look and really decent skills in the ring. And I think that if they had really committed to his character, I think that they could have done something with it. Like Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer said that the gimmick was 5 years too late. And, I understand and I agree with why he would say something like that. What do you think?
I don't know if I would agree with that because he came along right around the time of the Gulf War.
Right.
So talking summer of '90, he was in WCW, and patriotism got a boost at that time, and especially considering the fact that WWE took their real life GI Joe and Sergeant Slaughter and turned him heel.
Well, see, that's what I was going to say. I think that if
Yeah.
he had gone that way, and like I was just watching Broken Skull Sessions with Kurt Angle, and
Mhm.
they talked about how he was a real life. Obviously, he actually won the gold medal, but
Yeah.
he came on and was a heel. And I think that if they had drifted into that with Ranger Ross, it could have been really interesting.
Yeah, but even if they made him their rah patriotic baby face and threw weight behind him that way, I think he definitely could have been at the U.S. title level
I was
for.
going to say mid Carter, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. At least during that period, ride what is popular. But yeah, again, him going heel, I'm not sure how they might have done that with him. And from everything I've watched of him, he might have rejected that. He might not have wanted to do that, especially considering his character. I think he was very serious about representing the Army Rangers in the U.S. in a positive light. So I don't know if he would have dug that, but yeah, it is something that might have worked depending on the situation. And I think another thing too for the push is if you look at who he went up against. Again, WCW booking this time was still very old school. So the idea is, okay, if we have this patriotic USA gimmick, he has to wrestle foreign heels, which they
Right.
didn't have a lot of foreign heels at the time. They brought in the Iron Sheik there for the Clash. He was in a feud with the Cuban Assassin, who was very much a low Carter guy. And like I found a couple matches where he was wrestling the Terrorist, which was just a
Right.
dude in a generic mask
Right.
and things of that nature. So I don't think in their minds they had a proper foil for him, even though I think if they would just said he is our patriotic military guy as we're in the middle of the Gulf War and just put him against whoever their heel was that they wanted to either get over or someone they thought he could get over on.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
like obviously they wanted him to be that patriotic character, and like I guess they were trying to, a lot of the podcasts you hear, they would try in those days to mimic a lot of things that WWF was doing,
Mhm.
and I think that okay, you have a patriotic character, well, do something with it. I mean, here's a guy that is suggesting stuff to you, and you're giving him, matches that are only a few minutes long.
Yeah.
So it's and let's talk more. You mentioned some of his feuds. Let's talk about some of his notable matches here.
Sure.
And these are in no particular order. You had mentioned the Terrorist. He faced the Terrorist at Clash of the Champions 7 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And earlier in that event, you would see Army boot camp footage featuring some of the wrestlers that were with the company at that time, and Ranger Ross was doing boot camp stuff there, which was a cool little thing. He was obviously very much in his element, and I thought what was notable about that event is that being that it was at Fort Bragg, he got a heck of an ovation at that event, and obviously there were a lot of military personnel there, and but people were loving him at that event, and it was a really short match. It was a cool thing, but when I see stuff like that, I think, okay, they could have capitalized on something here. They could have at least raised this guy's game to another level, like mid Carter, which is what we were saying, United States
Right.
level, TV title level. And speaking of TV title, he did have a TV title match against Arn Anderson, which was one of his better matches. Obviously, Arn Anderson is great in the ring.
Yeah, and definitely one of his longer ones too. I that's one I really wanted to talk about, and it was minus the entrances about 7 minutes. And it's interesting to note that this is face Arn. This was right before the
Right.
Four Horsemen wound up turning on Sting. So even though Arn was still Arn, he was a face. So this was a face versus face match with the two of them. And I think if you watch this match, because again, Arn can make anybody look good, but Ranger Ross hung with him. I thought this
Yep.
was a pretty decent technical match for only being about 7 minutes on TV. I thought that Arn allowed Ranger Ross to hang with him. I think he did a lot to help get Ross over. I enjoyed the match. Yeah, again, if you're going to pick a Ranger Ross match to watch, I would highly suggest the Arn Anderson match.
Absolutely. And he had a notable loss to Butch Reed at Wrestle War 89. He faced Lex Luger. And I laughed because I watched this match and I was looking at the comments beforehand. This was a submission loss to Lex Luger. This is when Lex Luger was a heel. And while getting in the ring with his flag, he hit Tommy Young in the face.
Yeah, and then him and Tommy had words. Yes.
And yeah, that you can see that they have words. And, you know, I don't know what was said. Tommy Young didn't look too happy to take that flagpole to the face. But, if I were him, if Ranger Ross, that is, pronouns bout, I would have said, well, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Why you stand right where I'm going to get in?
Know your space in the ring. That's what a referee is supposed to do. Know where they're at. Right. But by the way, we should also mention that Tommy Young is one of the greatest, if not the greatest referee of all time. You Absolutely. Go back and watch a lot of Flair matches from the era and watch Tommy Young. Don't watch everything. Just watch what Tommy Young does.
Yeah, well, Tommy Young was high-hatting him there.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing with this flagpole? You got to watch. I'm Tommy Young, you know.
Yeah, don't be hitting me with a flag. See, hey, that's going to be the first T-shirt out of these videos. Damn it, I'm Tommy Young. That's going to be our first T-shirt. But that match, too, is one that I wanted to talk about. It's a short squash for Luger. And actually interesting, Luger's a heel, but every woman in the crowd is going bananas for him.
Yeah.
But in that, again, it's a short squash, but Ranger Ross sells his ass off for Luger.
Yeah.
I mean, Luger looks like $1 billion thanks to how well
Especially
Ranger
in that
Ross
bear hug.
Yes. Yeah. Not a great bear hug. I don't know if I ever remember Luger using the bear hug a lot.
Right.
You know, it was always the torture rack, and of course he would attack the back to set up the torture rack. Not a great bear hug, but, you know, Ross sold it fantastically. He sold every shot fantastically. He sold the torture rack fantastically. So if his job in that, if they just say, hey, go out and make Lex Luger look as great as you can, he fulfilled his mission in that match. Totally.
And you know what? Side note on bear hugs. How many people actually did a bear hug really, really well? And even though he did it in a lazy way, I can only think of one person who, when they put on that bear hug, you believed, okay, this would probably hurt like hell. And that'd be Andre. You know, but I mean, I'm trying to think, you probably could come up with more names than me.
One Man Gang was the first name I thought of.
There you go.
Yeah. One Man Gang did a good bear hug. And of course, Andre. And maybe that's another series we can do, like the best people to do a move, and then pick something like the bear hug. Who had the best bear hug?
We'll work on the title, but
yes, we'll figure. Everything's a work in progress at this point for us still. And another thing before you go on to another matches, I made a note here that there was another match I wanted to mention that I watched. It was against a jobber whose name I can't remember now, but anyway, Ranger Ross in the match does he knocks the guy out of the ring, and then he does like a vertical leap over the top rope.
Yeah, I saw that in a different match. Yep.
Yeah, it's like a 3-step drop. It's like a 3-step walk, and then and it amazed me. Like I've never seen a guy do that before.
Yeah, no, I saw that in a different match. I want to say it was, I mean, the other two matches, like he's had a lot of matches, unlike Big Billy Busick, who had a very short career.
Yeah,
Ranger Ross had a career that spanned almost 20 years, if you can believe that. We'll talk more about that later. But, you know, some of the other matches I put down there, he had a loss to
Pat Rose. That was the guy who was against that I saw him do on Pat Rose.
And he might have done it against Sid Vicious at Clash of the Champions 8. He lost to Sid Vicious at that event. Actually, he got destroyed by Sid Vicious at that event. Sid Vicious.
Big Billy Busick got destroyed by Sid Vicious.
So they have that in common. They
have that in common. They both got destroyed by Sid Vicious.
So next time we do one of these spotlights, it'll be somebody else that got destroyed by Sid Vicious. We'll just kind of go down that chain. 7 degrees of Sid Vicious. But at one point Sid does this. He does his regular power bomb to finish it, but at another point he does this like twirling, throwing power bomb. And Ranger Ross, they say in the commentary, Jim Ross says he's not a small guy, but like Sid Vicious just tosses him like it's nothing. Which so, if you decide to watch Clash 8, it's only a few minutes out of your life. But another one of his losses was to the Great Muta, and obviously the Great Muta is really great. This match is not that great. I don't know that I would.
I thought it was really sloppy. I watched that one
was.
too, and there's a part where Ross goes to throw. No, he goes for a crossbody, not the kick. He goes for the crossbody, and Muta. I don't know if Muta was out of position. Yeah, and Jim Ross had a cover saying that Muta saw it coming and basically fell down because that's what it looked like. So I don't know who was out of position there.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I don't know who's at fault in that match, because honestly, there's a couple moments in that match where it looks like Muto is at fault, really. But hey, this is like a random match from many years ago. It's not really that important. But Muta was very smooth in the ring, but they, we'll just chalk it up to the fact that they didn't really have chemistry.
Yeah, it could be, and again, language barrier. This was early on in Muta's U.S. career, so he was still being married by Gary Hart at the time. So
right. Well, let's now move on from our notable matches. Let's move on to the post-wrestling years of his life.
Before we do that, I do want to mention we didn't talk about his finisher, the combat.
Oh, my gosh, you're right. I meant to start out with that. See, this is a work in progress, folks.
Yes,
So just pretend that I mentioned this at the beginning of our notable matches part. His finisher, go ahead, Leonard. What was his finisher?
It was called the combat kick, which I don't know if it was a K for combat or not. It should have been. And it was I thought it was a super kick, although he called it like a side savate kick or something like that. And
that's what he calls it. It's like a defensive type kick that he learned in training. But I mean, hey, he wasn't a lot. Obviously, he's not the first person to have a kick, but I mean, this predates how popular they are now. Certainly,
and before Shawn Michaels was using the super kick as a finisher, so. So Ranger Ross beat Shawn Michaels on using a kick as a finisher and coming down on a wire.
And to continue who did move the best way, obviously Shawn Michaels does super kick in a really great way. Nobody stopped the way he did it, but Ranger Ross did it earlier. So there you take that, Shawn Michaels.
Shawn Michaels stole everything he did from Ranger Ross.
Ranger Ross, quote that.
Yes.
But so we'll move on to our post wrestling years, and they are fun filled. Let me tell you.
Yeah. Before you do that, I'd like to say when I first mentioned that we should do Ranger Ross, I did not know about his post wrestling career at the time. I just knew that he had been an Army Ranger. He had wrestled. I really remembered him, like I said there a little bit ago. So yes. If you do not know about Ranger Ross's post-wrestling career, prepare to be as amazed as I was when I looked it up.
Right. And so, he after leaving WCW on bad terms, now I tried to look up what exactly those bad terms were. I don't know. Perhaps the racial discrimination suit he filed is an indication of why he left. He did file a lawsuit against them. He would lose that lawsuit, but he was working as a private investigator as well as a part-time probation officer in Ackworth during the early 90s. He collected fines and probation fees in that area. But in February of 1996, he was arrested at his home in Ackworth and formally charged with bank robbery. He had gone to a bank, and as he talked about in a shoot interview, he went to the bank. He didn't have a gun. He just knew that when he went into the bank and demanded money, that they had to give it to him. And so that's what he did. He went, he robbed the bank, and he was known as the Motorcycle Bandit, which I feel like they could have come up with a better name. But hey, he was the Motorcycle Bandit. And,
I assume he was driving a motorcycle.
Yes, he definitely was. He definitely was. And he, basically his conscience got to him. And he met with his attorneys and then with the FBI, and he turned himself in. He, it's just a crazy story. I don't know if it's positive that I thought initially, well, damn, he got away with it before he turned himself in. But that's what I thought of.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think. I mean, were they on to him? Were they not on to him?
That's what I'm curious. Like, I'd be asking him these questions,
And how many times does the FBI get a call and it's like, Yeah, like I robbed a bank. Would you like to come, arrest me for that?
Right. And so, in addition to that, he was asked in this shoot interview about a rumor that had circulated that he tried to burn down the police station before he was detained, but he said that wasn't true. He was working as a part-time probation officer and he was embezzling money, so he burned a file drawer that contained a bunch of records and got charged with second-degree arson. And this all happened around the same time, so he wasn't messing around. And there's a good clip from TMPT Empire podcast where he talks about his time in prison. He spent 8 years in prison, and he basically spent that time getting an education. He got a degree in mobile small engines and started a business to that effect. He became ordained as a preacher and occasionally does that. He got remarried. He's involved with a lot of charities. So, this is one of those, we hear too often, in wrestling that, people pass away too early or they're really struggling financially. And I have no idea what his financial situation is, but this is a guy who turned his life around and really learned from his mistakes, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was fantastic. Everything that I read and heard about what happened after, again, this is from his perspective. So it's hard to say maybe if that's 100% true, but at least from everything that you can just observe around him, it seems like he really has straightened out his life. So that's fantastic to hear. And the fact that he's still kind of connected to wrestling a little bit, he seems to do autograph shows and interviews and is still very much in love with pro wrestling and love the fact that he had that experience of wrestling, especially on a national level. So, yeah, I think this is a best case scenario for someone who went down as far as he did, being a felon who did prison time, to being where he's at now, where he's a successful businessman, preacher, and is still able to share his love for wrestling. I mean, that's fantastic. Happy to hear. I don't know how keen I would have been to do Ranger Ross if that didn't have that happy ending. If he was still in prison now or had maybe passed away. But the fact that he and I watched the same clip that you just mentioned, and he talks about how that was a wake-up call for him. That the second they slapped the handcuffs on him, he was like, they could let me go right then, and they never would have another problem with me. And he was probably right. But the fact that then he took that prison time to, as he says in that clip, I went to school. He didn't consider it prison. He considered it college. And the fact that he bettered himself from it, it's fantastic to hear. And I think that makes his really amazing story even that more amazing that it has such a happy ending.
Absolutely. So let's go over some random notes here. Sure. He talked earlier in his career, he mentioned that he had told, that J.J. Dillon had told him that at that time, now this is like really early in his career, that J.J. Dillon had told him that the NWA already had a African-American talent they were using at that time, Joe Coltrane. So they passed on using him. And so when asked, Ross said this was his very first experience with racism in wrestling, as Ross said, and he didn't experience that in the military because there wasn't really any time for that while you were with the Rangers. You had a job to do. And so when he got into WCW, while working for Jerry Blackwell, he heard that Crockett's company had been sold to Turner, and so he thought maybe they would welcome more people from different ethnicities. And so that's how he got into the company. He spoke with Jody Hamilton and then George Scott, who had plans for him, and George Scott was fired a month later, but he still got a job. And another random note was that he said a lot of guys in that era had, massive egos and, didn't like to dress with some of the others, but he said Sting was one of the people that was really nice to him. And he wouldn't really list who was not nice, but he did mention about Ric Flair that everybody mocked Ric Flair because he would always say stuff like, I swear on my children. And he was one of those people that never kept his word. So, which I find interesting. So Leonard, what do you think? Do you have any final thoughts to wrap up here with Ranger Ross?
Oh, not really, other than the fact that, what I just said. I'm happy to hear that, he straightened himself out, that he's doing well now. Again, he was just, when we started this series, And you asked me, well, who do you want to do next? Again, he came to mind because he stuck with me. And I think that G.I. Joe element, which I mentioned, is one reason why. And like we've said throughout this entire video, I think he's someone who could have had a much bigger career if WCW would have committed to him at that time period. Here's a question for you before we close out. What do you think might have happened, good or bad, either which way, if WWF had signed him at the time?
I think that Vince would have given him like some sort of a military gimmick, but knowing Vince, he might have tried to, have him be a heel. Now, who knows? Because the WWF at that time had, they had Hacksaw Jim Duggan, who was, a very patriotic character. Maybe he could have tagged with him or something, gotten his start that way. Who knows? I mean,
they both carried U.S. flags to the ring, so they had that with Duggan and Ross, and of course Hulk Hogan was being their super patriot at the time as he was going up against Sergeant Slaughter. If anything, Ross might have just been cannon fodder for the heel turned Slaughter.
Right.
You build Ross up to take like that major loss heading into WrestleMania 7 or something like that to help build Slaughter a little bit more before he loses to Hogan.
Right. Yeah.
But I just thought that just now, what would have been. Again, I don't think he would have been main event level over there either. But it's interesting to think. But if we're doing these spotlights of lesser known people, I think Ross was a great one for us to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I forgot to mention in regards to his feud with the Iron Sheik is that he had said that the Iron Sheik, before one of their matches in Dayton, Ohio, had oiled himself up with baby oil so much that when he went to do a hip toss against the Sheik, that Iron Sheik apparently landed on his head and called him a jabroni backstage. And that, I guess, didn't help his case at WCW. But, I don't know if it's the same match that as it was for Clash 6, but I looked as Iron Sheik got into the ring, and you could see a glisten for sure. So the idea that he puts a lot of baby oil on is, to me, very probable. So, and another random note is that he apparently recorded a rap album. And,
I know, I read that
went
one.
to WCW with the idea of being a rap character, but they turned it down. And he talked about how they eventually went with PN News.
Yes, PN News, which we should do PN News at some time. He is in one of my favorite worst matches, which is the scaffold match, him and Bobby Eaton versus...
Where he's afraid of heights.
Yes. Maybe they did that to him as a rib, but it's Bobby Eaton and PN News versus Steve Austin and Terry Taylor. So you have three fantastic workers and then PN News on this scaffold. And I actually wound up meeting Bobby Eaton at a live show, and I asked him about that match, and he just like hung his head and went, "Man, what'd you have to ask me about that? I've been trying to forget about that match for 25 years." So now we're off on a tangent, but
we're into the weeds with PN News. Maybe maybe that's
next time. Our next spotlight might be PN News.
The wrestling gods are speaking to us, and they're telling us who to go with next. Well, just to wrap up with Ranger Ross, I will say that I think that he was really decent in the ring. I love how his life has turned out now. He still looks pretty good, for his age. From what I've seen, he's a family man and he's doing really well. I think that had WCW invested more in him, or if he had, like you said, gotten a chance up, in the New York area with WWF, who knows what could have happened. I think that he had enough potential there, though, that they could have done something with him. He retired in 2005, and as I said earlier, he was in a tag match with Ted Allen. In that, so he was a part of his final match as well as his first match, which is a really cool factoid. The highlights of his career were facing Bob Orton Jr. and Dick Slater, who were two of his idols, which is really cool. So it's definitely a guy with some notable moments. It's fun to look back at these because I've been watching some of the clashes. When I watch and listen to the podcasts that cover and review these events. And sometimes I'll be honest, when I'm watching these events, it's just for like, mental preparation for these podcasts, just so I know more of the background. But one of the Ranger Ross matches, I didn't really remember him much because in those matches, they're very short and I might not even be fully paying attention. But that's what makes these spotlights really cool to me, because I can go back and really focus on the person we're talking about and really get a feel for what they brought to the table, if anything. And I think he did bring some stuff to the table. So,
yep, definitely.
And, but maybe not PN News. So we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah.
And we thank you for joining us on the spotlights. Keep track of the name changes, though, because you never know. Right, Leonard?
Right.
That's right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This is the Nitty Gritty, and we will see you next week. Thank you.